when we start, I want you to recognize something. I have taught you design from the top down instead of from the bottom up. So I started you out here on the surface, and I bring you down to the gates, and then I bring you down to the lines. But the reality is that we're built from the bottom up. We're built from the base up. That from the base comes the tone, and out of the tone comes the color, and out of the color comes the line, and out of the line comes the gate. In other words, it's moving this way, it's moving upwards. So it's very important to understand something about color. Color not only is a bridge in that sense between tone and line, but color has an enormous influence over the way in which line operates. It just does. And what you're going to see is that the underlying themes that are inherent in the motivation in the color, that these themes get lived out all the time in the line that's above. So for example, let's start with the first color. And remember that the first color is going to resonate to the first line. All first colors will resonate to the first line. Our first color is fear. It's fear. Remember that whenever we're dealing with the first line, we're dealing with the beginning of an evolutionary process. In other words, if I was talking to you about the nature of a first line, and we would look at, my favorite examples, whether it's the 7-1, the authoritarian that has to be the boss. This is the way leadership begins. We start off with somebody who's heavy, who's authoritarian. It's the beginning of the leadership process. Or the 59-1, in the way in which we sexually bond, that we start off with the caveman or the cave woman. We start off with very, very basics and fundamentals. So the first basic motivation is fear. It's the foundation. It's the foundation of what motivates humanity. It's the foundation. We can see that around. It's so easy to bring fear to the surface, isn't it? There's fear everywhere. By the way, they announced this morning they're expecting more attacks in the United States in a couple of days. There's fear everywhere. Okay, so our basic foundation in terms of motivation is fear. Now think about what that actually means in terms of how you live out your design. Every first line that you have resonates to fear. And when we look at the first line, we know that the first line is involved with trying to overcome its potential inferiority, trying to be secure by finding a solid foundation. But what's the motivation? The motivation's fear. It's fear that's driving them to find that solid foundation. It's fear that's driving them in order to get to that place of security. It's fear that drives, in that sense, all first lines. Now think about what that's like if you have a first color in your profile. It means you are then going to be motivated. Your color is going to be fear. And it is fear that is going to drive you. Now look, the way in which this fear operates is that all colors, like all lines, are a duality. Everything about us is dualistic. And when you look at the dualities that are inherent in the color, what you see is that they are a moving tension. That we can move from one to the other, that they're always there. When you're looking at the first line fear, you have two themes. One is called communalist, and one is called separatist. Now think about that. This is the underlying nature of how fear is going to come out as a motivation. In other words, the way that some people are going to deal with fear is that they're going to look for a community where they can be protected. I can get rid of the fear by becoming a communalist. I can get rid of the fear by being joined with others, so as we stand together, we can fight off the enemy. The other side of that fear is the separatist. The separatist says, I am going to avoid the fear by getting away from those that threaten me. That I'm going to run, that I'm going to hide, that I'm going to get away from that. Every single first color operates out of those themes and becomes the motivation that impacts on the lines that are there. Now think about your own design. All of those activations that you have, every single one of those activations has a color underneath. And you're going to have first colors there. And think about how that impacts on you in terms of the way in which the nuance of your line, your gate, your channel that's defined, if it's defined, how that's going to operate. Let's say that you're somebody who has the 37.5, and the 37.5 is love. Right? It's the potential love of the family. It's also the potential to hate, based on emotional dependency. And you have a first line underneath, a first line profile theme for that. That person, the only way in which they're going to live out that fifth line with the first line with the first color underneath, is that it's fear that's going to drive them. And it's fear that's going to drive them to love. Or it's fear that's going to drive them to run away from love. That they're either going to be communal or they're going to be separatist. But they're always being motivated by the same thing underneath. And what's lying underneath is this deep fear. And this is the basis of what we are. I mean, you'll see we move through that whole spectrum. But I'm somebody that has 11 first lines. So my 11 first lines are always resonating, whether they have a first color underneath or not. Every time I meet a first color, every time I go, whatever that is, the fear is instantaneously palpable. Palpable. And of course, I'm the ultimate communal separatist. That's me. Not really in, not really out. And I've been both. And all out of a motivation that I have no control over. None whatsoever. In other words, all of those first lines of mine, they're always open and susceptible to being conditioned motivationally by fear. And some of them are first line colors underneath. I know, I've been there. Very important to understand that we have forces that are working on us that changes the way the surface is played out.
When you meet somebody with the first line, you feel their fear or your fear?
No. When I meet somebody with the first color.
With the first color, yes. The fear is
palpable. My lines will resonate to that, so it's palpable.
But whose fear is palpable? Yours?
The fear.
The fear.
The fear.
Okay, because
not mine, not theirs. The fear, because fear then becomes the thing.
Mm-hmm. In the air.
Yeah, It's in the air. You feel it. When you're looking at color, you can look at the way the world works, because these are underlying motivations for the planet itself and the way in which we operate. So one of the major political themes that we have dealt with from the very beginning of our process, is this theme of communalism, separatism. And it is a theme that we see everywhere. We see separatist factions that exist in all kinds of places. When you look at, whatever it may be, the Basques in Spain, or, whatever happens to be the separatist movement, you can see that there is always this process that's going on between separatism and communalism in the way in which geopolitics operate. And that both of them are claiming that they're separatists out of fear. I don't want to lose my culture. I don't want to lose this. I don't want to lose that. I don't want to be threatened. All of them are operating out of fear. The communalists say, well, if we work together, then we can do better, and we don't have to be afraid, and we've got better security. In other words, you always have these two forces that are at work. It's the basic foundation of how we operate. And of course, one of the things to recognize about the presence of such a powerful motivating force as fear, and to recognize that the fear exists below the line, that at the psychological level, think about somebody that has a very assured chart. Somebody, for example, that might be, let's say, a manifestor, or a very strong generator, whatever the case may be, somebody's got a strong chart. In that chart is, the strength to deal with the world and go out and do this and do that. And think about what happens to them when their profile theme is going to be dominated by fear. All of a sudden that assuredness and that comfort that seems to be there on the surface really isn't there. And there are so many human beings who suffer from not understanding why they seem to have what appear to be irrational fears. They don't know why they're afraid. They don't know why certain situations bring fear out of them. And of course, that's the moment that they're really in trouble if they go looking for traditional help. Because that's the moment that somebody's going to make up a reason for them about why they think they're afraid in that situation. Instead of understanding that this is their nature, that they are going to be in certain situations in which that motivating force is going to be there, and they have to learn to recognize that in order to understand it's okay. This is not an irrational fear. It isn't at all. It's the fear that drives us to master the world. It's the fear that's there that guides the investigator. And it's the fear of the unknown. It's the fear of the unknown. And it's about getting to the point where the unknown is no longer frightening, getting to the point where things are solid. And so what we call science, all of that is a first color. It's all about overcoming fear through being able to study, investigate, and find a solid foundation. And whether you find that solid foundation in an investigation as a separatist, the mad scientist in the basement by himself, or whether you do that, for example, in these huge communal scientific investigation laboratories where thousands of people are trying to figure out things together, whether it's communalist or separatist, these are the underlying themes of our development. In the garden, the first color was the first color. Here, fear. Overcome the fear through the pursuit of knowledge. That's what's there. Now, of course, what happens to the mundane life that is being impacted by the first color is that, they don't care about all that. What they care about is that in certain situations, they have an uncomfortable fear and they don't know why it's there. And in those situations of that uncomfortable fear, either they want to run in and join something in order to feel safe, or run away from it in order to feel safe, and they don't know why. And the danger again in that is that you see the psychological community has come up with all of their ways of trying to explain those things and make up reasons for why those things exist, when in fact it's just mechanical. It's just mechanical. And that the only way in which you can deal with the first color is the way in which you deal with the first line. In other words, you have to get rid of the fear by understanding. And it's only through understanding that the fear can move away. If you're a 1-3 or a 1-4 or a 4-1 or a 5-1, if you're any of those four profiles that carry a first line, you have to understand something. You're being conditioned. You're being conditioned, whether you have the first color in your profile or not. Every time you step into the world, you're being conditioned through residence, and you're being conditioned to be motivated by fear. When I get on airplanes, with all my first lines, when I get on airplanes, as long as there's anybody on that airplane that has first colors, the fear resonates through my body. And I know it's not me, because I'm truly, in terms of how I know myself, I'm not afraid in those situations, but I can actually feel the fear rising because I resonate to it. Now, I'm very comfortable in the knowledge of who I am, so I really know who I'm not. And I'm always very able in those kinds of situations to let those things move through. But I also recognize that the vast majority of humanity is not like that. And that if you carry a first line in your profile, that it's very easy for you to be made fearful by others. And it's not like they have to threaten you. They don't. They just have to be in your aura. And all of a sudden, there is this quality of fear, and you don't know why it's there. And for most people, they feel uncomfortable with that because they think there's something wrong with them. Or worse than that, they do something about it. In other words, they react to that conditioning. And in reality, because I can remember myself before I had all this knowledge, color revealed so much to me about the way in which the world impacted me and why I was always happiest being left alone and totally isolated. Being a separatist was really easy for me because nobody was cranking up all my ones. Yet at the same time, the communal forces that cranked up my ones made me a better teacher, made me a better investigator, made me deal with their fears so that I had to come up with better and better ways of explaining how things work. In other words, you have to see the positives in the negatives in the conditioning. But I want all of you to understand as we go through all these colors, that whatever you have as lines in your profile, aside from whether you can find out what your actual color is in the profile, whatever lines you have in your profile is going to resonate to these motivational themes. And for you to recognize that, it will give you a deep, deep insight into your relationship with the other and the way you operate in relationship to the other.